you make the Shabbat a delight? And here's what a rabbi said. With a dish of vegetables, either spinach or beets, and a large fish and garlic. And then that's a good meal, but it said even something very small, if it is prepared specifically in honor of the Shabbat, is a delight. And what is an example of this? A pie of fish hash and flour. Now, I've never had fish hash and flour, but it might sound pretty good. But here's the story I have in here that I want to read you. The emperor asked a rabbi, "What gives your Sabbath meal such an aroma?" He replied, "We have a spice called Shabbat, which is added to each dish we serve." The emperor said, "Give me some of this spice." The rabbi replied, "If you observe the Sabbath, the spice works. But if you do not observe it, it does not work." And the rabbi said if the Jewish people would observe the Shabbat properly, even once, the Messiah would come. And why? Because it's equal to all the other commandments in importance. And so we celebrate it every week, but let's remember how special it is. And one of the things, as I read through here, is what was the first thing that God made holy? We go back to Genesis 1:1, and it wasn't a mountain, and it wasn't an altar. It was this day. The Shabbat is the first thing that is mentioned as being holy in the Scriptures. So, something to think about. So the Torah portion for this week is just one chapter long. One of the shortest Torah portions in the Haftorah is the Song of David at his end of his life, and it's also one of the longest Haftorah portions. So it's kind of a unique Torah portion. And it was the Song of Moses here was sung during the Second Temple period, and I would like to go back and hear that sung to music and see what it sounded like. I think someday we'll get to do that. But really, the song resembles a lawsuit. Glenn's agreeing with that. Between a superior, suzerain, a feudal lord, called during the Middle Ages, and his vassal subject. And if they had a treaty, if the vassal was unfaithful to the treaty, or covenant in this case, between God and man, there's a process. And so this song is that process. And God calls upon heaven and earth as to testify. And heaven and earth were created perfect, as is the Torah. That's one thing I always think about this book. You know, God didn't write any revisions. I can't look back here and say, well, in 1964 he updated it because everything changed. It's the same. He made it perfect when he wrote it. The only thing that's imperfect is us understanding it. But so what follows then is an interrogation. Questions are posed and accusations are made. And then a declaration of past benefits bestowed upon the rebel vassal by his overlord, and the ingratitude of the vassal. Finally, a declaration of guilt is made, and the vassal is either warned of coming judgment or warned to change his ways. And so, then really the subject through all of this is the rock. And who is the rock? It's mentioned 9 times in the Torah portion, 5 times in the Haftorah portion. And us and the rock, the Messiah. He is the rock. The rock was in the wilderness. He was the rock who conquered the land. He was a rejected rock, and he will be the rock who will smash Israel's enemies. And remember that Moses was excluded from going into the promised land because he struck the rock. And when we were in Israel, we were out in the middle of the desert. Well, not the desert, but the wilderness, really, south of Jerusalem. And where shepherds would be like Moses was when he was a shepherd for 40 years. And we did a teaching out there, and there was water weeping through the rock. And it was kind of a partially decomposed rock. And it was customary for a shepherd to strike the rock with his staff.
to allow more water to come out to feed his flocks. And so what Moses was doing was something that he had done many times before. So it was something he was reverted back to do, but it was not what God asked him to do. So the wise man built his house upon a rock. The song many of us remember from when we were young. So the problem is not with God, but the problem is with us. In 1 Samuel 25, the Haftorah is about David. So there's a story of David in 1 Samuel chapter 25. And that is on page 327. To help you along if you have the same translation. And I'd urge you to read the whole story. But it's about a story about Nadab. His Hebrew name is Navel. But throughout this whole story, David has protected this rich farmer with his men. He's been a security guard for him, basically. And Nadab had not lost any of his flocks. It is harvest time. He's shearing his sheep. And David sends some men to extract some payment, we would like some food. And he's had a good year. He's had a successful harvest. And what does he do? He blows off David's men. He basically kind of harasses them and sends them away. And David, when his men got back, David was ready to go with 400 men and kill Nadab and his men. However, Nadab's wife took food to David, and he blessed her for keeping him from shedding blood. And if you go to verses 32 to 35, David said to Abigail, "Blessed be Adonai, the God of Israel, who sent you today to meet me, and blessed be your tactfulness, and blessed be yourself for having kept me today from the guilt of shedding blood and taking vengeance into my own hands. For as the God of Israel lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you hadn't rushed out to meet me, not even one male would have been left to Nadab by morning." And so she had come out, intercepted them, brought them lots of food, and went back and told her husband, who got drunk. He'd had a good harvest, and so he imbibed. And so she told him the next morning when he was sober. And when she told him, he had a stroke. And if you go down to verse 39, actually 38, 37, he had a stroke and became motionless as a stone. And 10 days later, he died. And it says, some 10 days later, Adonai struck Nadab, and he died. When David heard that Nadab was dead, he said, "Blessed be Adonai for having taken my side in the matter of Nadab's insult, and for having prevented his servant from doing anything bad." On the contrary, Adonai has caused Nadab's bad deeds to return on his own head. And so, with Nadab, it is kind of with us. We live under God's protection every day. There's things that happen. Something happened to me this week, and I thought, God, that could have been really bad, and it wasn't. And there's many times we see it, many times we don't see it, and I don't think we'll see it till we get to the end of our life and see all the times He's protected us. And God is not as concerned about our comfort and making us all rich and famous as He is drawing us to Himself. And so through all of the things that He allows to happen to us, He wants us to draw close to Him. So we're like Nadab. Are we grateful for God's protection? So, in a conventional lawsuit, the king would send his army and basically decimate the vassals if they did not change their ways. But here we come to a difference between a secular pagan king and the King of Kings, King of the universe. God knew that Israel would not be faithful to Him. And He knew that they would rebel, but He refuses to destroy Israel because He promised that He would not destroy them by an oath on a previous covenant He made with their forefathers, which shows His grace and mercy as He brings not only does he not destroy them, but he brings them back from their rebellion and brings them back to himself. So as you go through this Torah portion, down at verse 7, it talks about history. And all of God's holidays, really, speak of history. Passover is, what is the first thing? Remember. Remember. And if people who forget their history, what? History repeats itself. We make the same mistakes again. Because we're people. And so we need to remember. And it's an important thing. When we go down to verse 10, the people were faithful in the desert, for they accepted the Torah, and he protected them. And then in verse 12, he has brought them into the land. He's helped them to conquer the land. And but they're like all of us. They got fat, dumb, and happy. Best way to put it. When we're desperate, we cry out for mercy, but oftentimes when things are going well, we forget. And that's an important thing, that we don't forget. But they did. They forgot. And so they, as we go down, verse 19, they followed the other gods, the non-gods, who are really not gods at all, the gods of the nations who they overtook. And then down verse 24, 25, we see judgment, which takes me back really to thinking of Jeremiah. But the judgment's because of our own fault. And God places our enemies where he wants them to bring us really back to him. And we should cry uncle and not be stubborn. But you remember the story of Jeremiah. The king thought, oh yes, we'll defeat these people who are coming to attack us. And Jeremiah understood that the reason they were coming was because of God's judgment upon them as a nation. And basically said, surrender to him. And so they figured he was a traitor because he didn't have a lot of Israeli pride. We're going to whoop him, I guess. And so it really brings me to think about where we're at as a nation. We've shed a lot of innocent blood in this nation, and there is a price to pay for that. And what does God's judgment look like on us? Things are changing out there. They're changing really fast. It's not the safe world it was when I grew up in the town of Mayberry. When kids could just play on the street, and I could ride my bicycle anywhere. And I was talking to somebody the other day about that. I used to go down to the mechanic shop. There were two mechanics that worked there, and they'd been through World War II. One of them was in tanks behind enemy lines in Germany. And I can remember as a young kid, fascinated by the stories they told. And I was down there a couple of years ago and went and talked to Kenny, who was the old mechanic. And he said, well, we might have embellished them a little bit. But I told him I remembered that. And I was talking to a gal from Avista whose cousin is married to Kenny's son. And, good memories. But it's a different world today for our kids. And so we have to be cognizant of that. But as we go down, verse 26, 27, the fact that Israel exists today is really a testimony to the existence of God. Because what other nation has come back from being dead to still being in existence? And they exist, and they're not just existing, they're growing. Verse 27 and 31, it talks about a nation without common sense. As I read through some of the commentaries, that's talking about the nations that came in and attacked Israel, the pagan nations that were used by God to carry out his judgments against Israel. And they were used of God for a specific purpose. But oftentimes they became proud, thinking that they were in charge and they were the ones that had made themselves great. No different than us today. And so I want to take you to Daniel, about King Nebuchadnezzar. Take you to Daniel chapter 5. I'm going to drop down to Daniel chapter 5, verse 18. And Daniel's answering the king. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father the kingdom, as well as greatness, glory, and majesty. Because of the greatness he gave him, all the peoples, nations, and languages trembled with fear before him. Anyone he wanted to, he put to death. Anyone he wanted to, he kept alive. Anyone he wanted to, he advanced. And anyone he wanted to, he humbled. But when he grew proud and his spirit became hard, he began treating people arrogantly, so that he was deposed from his royal throne and his glory was taken away from him. And then it goes on to tell the story about him. But God uses nations for his purposes. And we are where we're at because he's done things for us. Down in verse 34 to 43, it references God's storehouses. And there's a verse in Job that speaks of his storehouses. And I did not write the page down for that. But Job chapter 38.
38.
Job 38. Job's an interesting book, and I'm not finding it.
1039.
1039? Thank you. Job 38, 22 to 23. Speaks of God's storehouses. Have you gone into the storehouses for snow, or seen the storehouses for hail, which I save for times of trouble, days of battle and war? If you remember back as Israel was fighting various wars, what did God do? One time he sent hail, and it destroyed more of the enemy with the hail than it did with their swords, because God was fighting the battle for them. As long as they remembered that, they did well. And when they forgot that and thought they were doing it on their own, that's when they failed. Same with us today. Our American Naval College used to teach, up until a few years ago, that every major naval battle that was won because of weather. I think there was a time when the French were going to invade England, and guess what? Fog came in and they couldn't do it. You know, God is the one who controls those things, and we think that we'd like to control the weather. It's a good thing we can't. But God uses these things to accomplish his purposes, and makes me think of Katrina. I spent a couple of months down there on the cleanup, and it was a mess. You could walk out in the woods, and you know how there's plastic bags? You know, you go to the dump, everything's in nice things, but down there were plastic bags in the tops of trees, and you might see a canoe on the top of a tree or anything. It was, wherever you went, it was a mess. But that storm was just kind of a little storm out in the middle of the ocean until we decided to tell Israel what to do. Guess what? The storm turned around and headed for our nation. And there's a whole book written about all those occurrences. Every time we tell Israel something, we get hit with storms. So, you know, God uses those things. He decides the fate of nations, and he will be the rock that will smash Israel's enemies in the end. And so at the end, be careful to obey. The Torah, though, is not about salvation, but about blessing. And Torah and faith equal abundant blessing. So we're part of that rock when we are united with him. He is the cornerstone, the foundation, which becomes the temple. And who meets in the temple? The assembly, us. So I want to take you to, it's not in your notes, but 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Verse 4. So he's reviewing to the Corinthians. Now I'm going to start with verse 1. For brothers, I don't want you to miss the significance of what happened to our fathers. All of them were guided by the pillar of cloud, and they all passed through the sea. And in connection with the cloud and with the sea, they all immersed themselves into Moses. Also, they all ate the same food from the Spirit, and they all drank the same drink from the Spirit. For they drank from a Spirit-sent rock which followed them, and that rock was the Messiah. And one of the things I've never noticed before, and that is that rock followed them. And so it followed them and was with them constantly throughout the wilderness, protecting them. And so, with that, any comments?
Good, he's turning to me. The only thing that was weird, isn't part of the story about the statue, about the rock that comes out and smashes the golden statue?
Mm-hmm. Which is a prophecy about the end of
It just popped in my head when you were
God destroying those nations.
Start thinking about rocks and places going.
Yeah, but you could do a pretty exhaustive study on all the mentions of rock throughout Scripture. And rocks were to them, you could hide in a cave. It was a shelter in a storm. They would write inscriptions on rock, things they wanted to remember. So a rock was something that was didn't change. What? They could even use them for pillows. Okay. With that, then, I'll turn it over to Michael.
Good job.